Hey, so I felt compelled to make this recording because the past few weeks, or I guess, um, like the past month since this new year started, I've been feeling different in some ways. I've been feeling, certain things, that I haven't really felt that much like last year or whatever in a while, I guess. Just certain things that kind of come up here and there. And I don't know. I felt like talking about them, or sort of talking about them in this case, that I thought might be useful, maybe in the future, whatever, like that, at some point, to myself to look back on them, or for other people to relate to, or sort of, I don't know, get something from it, I guess. But specifically yesterday, I was doing some work on the mod locked loot containers and stuff, and I've been working on it pretty frequently the past few weeks. And it's generally been going fairly well, slow and steady and all that stuff. But it was something specifically yesterday that kind of here, you know what? I'm gonna go to the smaller window just so whoops. There we go. I'm going to go to the smaller window just so this doesn't blow up the file size that much. But I was working on some of the formulas and stuff for the bashing logic, specifically the stuff for how what bashing should cost the player and stuff like what stuff like health, fatigue, weapon condition, like degradation that it does to the weapon being used, if using a weapon, stuff like that. And as I was working on these formulas and stuff, obviously in some cases I was getting pretty just like lost in thoughts, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, like or how I was going to do some of the stuff. And, in the end, I was able to get some of this stuff working, or not so. I don't even know if they're working or not, but at least I was able to get something down. But then I was looking at these formulas for some of them, especially where I was just like, man, what in the shit am I looking at? Like, I know exactly what I'm looking at because I made it in that moment, but then I look at it later, I'm like, what the hell like happened? And it's not so much that I think that they're necessarily bad or whatever. It's just I don't I feel like there's definitely a better way to do a lot of these things, which I think is always one of the kind of frustrations that I get and maybe other people get. I just don't know because I don't hear many people that do this kind of stuff talk about it, myself at least. They usually skip over these things for whatever reason. I guess they think that it doesn't matter. Or maybe they don't even know what they're doing and they just kind of do whatever they are possessed to do in that moment and it's just like, "Oh, yeah, just leave it that way." I mean, maybe the difficulty comes when you are doing this kind of thing on your own. You're not like say working for somebody on like a project or something that you're just kind of like a cog in the machine working on that project and taking away at it, but you really don't have that much creative input in the end of the day. You're just being told what to do. And I could see that being the case where people probably like it better that way because, when you're just kind of told what to do, you don't really have much time or you don't really have much need to think about how you want to do something or if the way that you're doing it is the best way or something like that. You're just kind of like solving a puzzle, but you're not actually like making the puzzle. If you kind of know what I mean. Probably don't, but probably don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but when you're working on a kind of creative project like a mod like this or any kind of artistic thing or whatever you want to call it, art, an image, a drawing, in this case, like a mod that does a function kind of deal or is intending to do a function like multiple different things. Uh, it's when you're working by yourself or working on yourself on it, you're the sole creative person behind the thing or whatever. You're the person that's making the decisions. You're the person that's making the end plans of what you want it to be and what the end thing should be or what you think it should be. It becomes more difficult to sort of know what line you're willing to draw, like when to stop. And I guess that's kind of how this always kind of happens when you have like full creative freedom per se or whatever. Then a lot of people just kind of go crazy, and that's when the idea of like feature creep and all that kind of shit comes through. And there is a time where you have to just kind of settle and tell yourself, all right, I have to stop here or whatever. You can't just keep continuing on whatever path you're going because it's going too far down and then you're never gonna finish it kind of shit. But that's what I was feeling yesterday when I was thinking about this and I was getting kind of like frustrated. Um, and I wasn't so much frustrated that I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do per se, but I was like frustrated at the end result more than anything because I was looking at it and I was like, I don't know, maybe it's like when I don't do like sculpting or whatever. Maybe if it's the same shit if somebody's doing like a clay paint or a clay sculpture or something like that. They just like they do it with their hands, they make it, they form it and all that stuff. Maybe they heat it, whatever you call it, cure it later and cook it in whatever oven that they have to do it to make it solidify or whatever and be solid. Then they just look at the end result, maybe afterward, and they're just like, "What the fuck kind of mess did I just make?" What is this like? Almost abomination. Like maybe not that extreme, but they just like, what did I just make? What is this thing? And that's kind of the feeling that I had yesterday when I was looking at some of the stuff for the formulas. Like I understand what it's doing, and I understand like for the most part why I did it. And if I actually like read it in like a sequence as I was, that's how I was making it in a sequence, like a sequence of how to do it like this, and that. It makes sense, mostly. But then when I just look at it, I'm just like, God damn, like, why does this look so goddamn ugly? And like, if somebody was gonna read this, in a layman, and maybe that's just impossible to make everything look good to a quote unquote layman perspective, like somebody else who doesn't know what like this might be or whatever. It looks very complex when it really isn't. But it just kind of looks complex. And there's probably so many things that could be said, like, oh, you don't have to do these are like unnecessary casts or whatever, unnecessary like explicit rounding things. But I've had problems before where if I don't explicitly have something round that is afloat and then round in a specific way, then it does it in a way that I don't want it to. Like it instead does a ceiling or it does floor, whatever it does with that number into a whole number, and I don't want it to do that. So a lot of the times I explicitly just tell it now to do like a round if it's a float number, and if the possibility of it being a float number is high in the end result. And some of these other things, like doing this shorthand logic here, where I could absolutely put this on, I could put so much of this stuff on separate lines. But then that annoys me almost even more when I look at it because then it's just like, okay, maybe not horizontally, it's not big on the lines, but vertically, then it just starts to bloat up vertically when you have like a million different lines doing each like one individual instruction at a time or whatever, adding this to add like it like end of the day it always just kind of looks like ugly. And I know it doesn't really matter that much the look because at the end of the day when this gets compiled it's just becoming binary or whatever. It's becoming just like ones and zeros and shit like that, whatever, into the computer language. So it doesn't matter necessarily how it looks besides when somebody looks and comes back to it and tries to interpret and understand what you're doing. And this is one thing that I'm kind of all over the place, but this is one thing that kind of annoys me is that sometimes this is why I try not to ask too many opinions of people or ask too many questions of people. Because a lot of the time I don't. Like a lot of the time I already know the answer, but I just kind of ask almost as a procrastination, which I know a lot of people do that, even if they don't admit it. They ask as a kind of procrastination, and you're hoping for an answer that you already know from the people, but then sometimes you get an answer that you don't want to hear or some shit like that. It sounds silly, but I think that's how it generally seems to work. Sometimes you do get something that you want to hear, something that you didn't expect to hear and you actually appreciate. But then a lot of the times you get an answer that you don't really care for or appreciate or whatever. Like when asking, like how would somebody else do one of these kind of problems or solve one of these kind of formulas? Like how would somebody else do these things? And then you're like, I'm not sure how I should do this formula. I want to do it in a specific way so it incorporates these kind of things, so it takes into account stuff like the player's attributes in various different levels, so they actually have like a purpose and they feel like they have an impact. But then when you try to show other people or whatever in this case how you what you're trying to do, then a lot of the time people just come back and say they don't get what you're doing or whatever. Like it's overcomplicated or you're overcomplicating it. But that response can kind of annoy me because I understand that whole very generic mantra of keep it simple, stupid. And yeah, simplicity is generally a good thing. You don't want to overcomplicate things. I understand that. But at the same time, when people say that, I think it's a very like empty-headed parrot kind of response that it's just kind of like a pre-programmed response that people say like, "Oh yeah, just keep it simple." And then but then in the same breath, those people will um tout people or tout developers or whatever that have complicated like detailed systems in their games, like stuff that they might not normally expect would be taken into consideration, like certain things like details, whatever you want to say, like certain things like, oh, that's cool that this thing happened, even though I wouldn't expect the game to normally even like I wouldn't expect the developer to normally even consider doing that. Like I'm having a hard time thinking if this one moment, but like I don't know, condition damage for like little things or whatever on items or weapons or some shit like that, or taking into consideration little details like that. And that's when that's when I think it's like a hypocritical statement to say keep it simple, stupid, because then it's like, well, if you want those little details that you seem to enjoy, then the keep it simple, stupid thing doesn't necessarily work then. Like it's a hypocritical kind of it's two things that can't really exist at the same time. Like maybe if somebody is a super genius on how to do this kind of these systems or whatever in a simple, super simple way, but at the same time making it so they can have a lot of detail and complexity into it, that's great. But for the most part, the more detail and the more quote unquote the more detail that you want to get into something, the more complex it becomes. Like just for something simple, like if you want to have a different if you want to have a different quote unquote like reaction or a different outcome happen if you are interacting with something that is made out of wood compared to metal or something like that. It's kind of an example from this where I'm having it so if you hit a wooden lock or a wooden chest, it has a different effect cost wise and chance wise and stuff like that compared to metal, because generally wood is not as hard as metal. Like there's examples where metal is softer than wood, but generally one would say that wood is not as hard as metal. So just in something like that, in that little detail, that makes it so you basically have to do two kind of separate branching paths, I guess you could say, branching logic paths, where one does a thing and then the other one does the other thing, like a similar thing, but it does it differently. Um, I'm sure that there's so many other ways you can do that, but I don't personally know how to. I don't know the simplest way to do it. This is just the way that I like do an if and else, an if or an if statement, and then having two kind of separate branching paths at that with two slightly different formula kind of thing. But the more complicated, just like with a dialogue tree or something like that, like the more complex that the dialogue system becomes, the more options and the more paths that you have, the more complicated at the end of the day that code and in general just that thing is going to be. So the people saying keep it simple, stupid, like I said, it's not. It's you could just have Space Invaders. You could just have Tetris or whatever. Like bad examples, but you could have something that has like extremely simple mechanically stuff, but very little other like cool details and stuff like that. And yeah, you could keep it simple in that way. But then these same people will be like, hey, this is not that. This is not. They would appreciate something that is more complicated, but then they don't understand what is necessary, at least as far as I understand, what is necessary to make something more complicated, more detailed, is you have to have more complex systems in this sense. You have to have more complex formulas and stuff like that. You have to have, if you want to do those extra details, like trying to make luck a useful attribute is makes every formula more complicated at the end of the day. Like, because the way that in Daggerfall it works, like in the vanilla game formulas, these things don't matter. Like, say in the combat formula, this is not how it works, but just say in the combat formula, if they wanted they wanted everything to matter, but to keep it simple, stupid, they're just like, well, let's just make it like D&D or some shit, and then have it so only agility and speed or something matters in the formula. But then it's like, well, then luck stops mattering. So that formula might be simple, but if you made it more complicated, then you'd be able to incorporate other attributes and make them actually matter as you kind of probably want them to actually have a purpose. So just doing something like adding luck in this case made this part much more ugly and complicated. But what other way is there? That's just kind of how and I don't know where I was going at with with that kind of like tangent there, but that's just one of the things that kind of frustrates me is I guess that people that don't understand is that if you want those extra details, which people want, they say that they want, and they clearly do when they praise things that have more of those details and stuff, you need to have them more complicated. And I like it that way too. It's just I'm willing to admit that because I guess I've been doing this, that you can't necessarily keep it simple, stupid when you want to have that more complex details and stuff and things like that. Systems. And even with that what I know what I want in this case, it still kind of always sucks when I think about it. Like I look at the formula afterwards or something like that, the whatever result I have, and I'm just like, oh my god, like just having the wood thing like almost doubles the amount of lines that I have for certain things. So it like, yeah, I like it, but it also kind of sucks because then it just looks like a fucking mess in the end. Because then if I try to work with this later on, like say if I changed how the condition works for weapons because I don't like how the condition works in the game where it's based on material, where it's like base material or base condition for an item of like I don't know, a mace, it gets just multiplied by whatever the material. So it's like whatever material modifier or something like that. So Daedric is times like 11 or whatever, or like times 9 condition, and iron is times 1. So it's like Daedric is 9 times more, has more condition value than iron. So if you try to do stuff like condition damage, you have to either make it considered, if you want it to be somewhat even for all of the materials, and it's not just like completely lopsided on it on the power spectrum, whatever, then you have to take that into consideration. So you either have to go by a percentage value, or you have to multiply all the other values by different amounts to even that amount out, which is what I did in Physical Combat Overhaul, at least at the time, where I just tried to make them all like a standard value and be like, okay, even though this one has 10,000 condition, this other one has 1,000 condition, then make it so, use some math to make it so they're both like on an even level kind of deal. And even that doesn't work great. But then with that taken into consideration, then it's like, well, if I ever do make a mod that changes that, then I'll have to like change all of this if I want it to be like function effectively together, because this is taking currently this is taking into a consideration that the condition values work as they currently do. So it's like, okay, just do percentage values instead of a flat damage amount. It's doing percentage based, which isn't optimal. Like, I like percentage values, but at the same time, it kind of can suck as I've been going through the formula, because I was like, well, now if I want to take strength and other things into consideration, I'm like, well, I don't want it to be absurd amounts where it's like 10%, 20% at a time, because then it's like, okay, now my weapon's broken in like 2 hits or something. But then if you make it too low, then it's not good either, because then it's like, oh, okay, it takes forever to break. Like, all that stuff you have to take and think about, or whatever, or realize that it's gonna have some effect later on that you have to like work on. And the more complex that the formulas become, then if I ever come back to this, it'll just be like, what the fuck am I looking at? So that, that kind of sucks. I don't know. I don't know what I was trying to get at with this. I was just trying to kind of voice my I don't know, the feelings I've been having. As I was saying at the beginning, I've been having worse. Not so much that my sleep has. Well, okay, it has been worse. I haven't really necessarily felt like tired. It's just that when I try to go to sleep, I've been having some insomnia like this whole month. Uh, a lot more like I normally wouldn't have insomnia. Well, yeah, I haven't had insomnia like this in a while. Try to go to sleep, then you go to sleep, and then you wake up a few hours later, and then you can't go back to sleep, and you're just lying there, like, wondering what time it is, and you're like, am I gonna get to sleep, and that kind of shit. So I've just been feeling kind of weird recently, and certain things, maybe it's just a frequency going through, or whatever, an energy, just an energy going through, because I know a lot of people are feeling similar things that I've been hearing, so it's not just me. But it's still, it still happens, and you still experience it, and you're just like, well, gotta deal with it at the end of the day, I guess. Just kind of comes and goes. And right now, it's currently coming through, and I'm just trying to deal with it, and I felt like recording this. But yeah, I don't know. Doing the creative process it's a very taxing thing sometimes, and it can make you really question what you're doing. Some days you're like, oh my god, like, you just look at the end result of what you did that day, and you're just like, what mess is this? Like, what am I getting to? It's just like this giant lines and lines of code or whatever shit, just like a whole mess of stuff, and you just think, which you should never really do, because it never really gets you in a better position. It just kind of fucks with your head more than anything, when you think like, how to these, because I haven't seen the source code of other games for the most part. Like, very rarely do you see that, and you always think like these, like, how did they do their stuff, and how did their code look at the end of the day? Because I mean, yeah, and then you see games that are simpler, that are made in like a more lower level language, like these NES games or whatever. You might be able to see the code in the assembly languages. And then you realize, which I guess can be a comforting thing in a way, is that they were in the same kind of position. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing. They just did whatever, and it's just like a mess, a spaghetti code or whatever shit, whatever was able to work at the time. But then now I think like I want my mods and everything. I want them to be able to be communicated with by other mods, so it's easier for them to make compatibility things. And then it just becomes more and more complex that you have to think like how to take that in consideration. I like settings, so I always want to put a decent amount of settings into my mods when I possibly can, but that always makes it more complicated. You have to put if statements or whatever, take into consideration if this is true, if that's false, if this setting is on, and this thing doesn't get taken into account. And then you just always like that's why it's maybe I'm just not looking hard enough, and maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. But people that do a lot of, or people that supposedly do programming a lot or whatever, they very, maybe it's just a character thing with people that do this kind of stuff. They don't really, they don't really express these kind of things genuinely that I feel like I'm doing right now. It sounds stupid because I know that there is people that do that, but you feel kind of alone because then it's like everybody else is like supposedly they're not talking about it, they're not talking about the problem, so how could you know? But then you're thinking like doubting yourself and doubting, and self-doubt is always an issue, but you're just like, why does this look like this? Why is this fucking a mess? Is this ever gonna get not a mess? How can I make it not a mess? And you don't know, and you're just kind of like sitting there wondering. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. I don't want this to go on too much longer, just a complete ramble here, but I just wanted to express some stuff that I've been feeling recently, and I specifically felt a twinge of this yesterday night after I worked on this, and I was like, what am I looking at, and what, like questioning how is this going this way, and is this just going to be completely destroyed and just wiped away because it's just a complete goddamn disaster mess right now or something, or is it just, I don't know, is this what the end result's really going to look like kind of thing? And I'm still questioning that, especially with the loot system, but at the very least I've seen it function, so it's like there. And in this I'm like, man, I'm probably gonna have to change so many things in the end that I'm not happy with, but I don't know. I guess that's just how it is sometimes, but yeah, just a ramble that maybe somebody might find useful, or maybe I'll find useful, but just felt like getting that out. But thanks for listening, I guess, and hope to see you next time. Take care.